Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Truth is Justice podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host. It's exciting and a real privilege to finally be able to address all of you in this podcast format. Many of you would be familiar with our website, our activity on various social media platforms, and through our active Truth is Justice Facebook group. We've been working very hard over the past few weeks to bring this podcast to fruition, and it is truly great to finally have reached the point where it can be released. I'd like to extend my enormous thanks to Atty for her wonderful and tireless help in transforming this project from a simple idea into what we see it is today. If you have seen any of our social media material, visited our website, or looked at the cover screen of this podcast, you will recognise the amazing work that Atty has done. Before I go on to explain a little bit about the background of Truth is Justice, I wanted to highlight a couple of important facts that distinguish us from some other podcasts in this genre. We don't have a Patreon account. We do not receive support from organisations that have an interest in a given outcome. We receive absolutely no corporate sponsorship, and we do not ask people to provide us with financial support. This project is entirely self-funded, and no one who is working on this project is paid in any way for their services. We are all donating considerable amounts of our time to this project because we believe that it is the right thing to do. This is not a money-making business. It is not a platform to promote myself or others, nor is it a show designed to entertain people through cringeworthy reveals or dramatic sound effects which surround so-called bombshells. In the end, we're a very small group of people who are steadfastly committed to ensuring that we do our part to set the record straight. Finally, I want to extend my sincere and overwhelming thanks to every single one of those people who have supported this project through their willingness to lend an ear, for taking the time to provide us with insight into the case, for facilitating the gathering of material in a timely fashion, and for those that have simply recognised our determination and commitment to do what is right and just. In my opinion, operating a podcast like this comes with great responsibility. A responsibility to be open and frank and to tell the full story whilst being considerate of every single person involved in the case. That means from the law enforcement officers tasked with securing the perimeter, to the medics tasked with dealing with the injured, to the jury members tasked with deciding the future of a member of their community, to the prosecutor and his or her team, which has been tasked with presenting a given case. Most importantly, and above all else, it requires an absolute respect for the victim of the crime. This is not the place for carnival tricks or verbal sleight of hand. This is a place for the facts and for the truth. Welcome, everyone, to Truth is Justice. some of you may be curious about how Truth is Justice came to be. Now, to best explain that, it's probably necessary for me to talk a little bit about my involvement with some other true crime podcasts and some of their various related Facebook pages. Now, it was quite by chance that I became interested and involved in a particular podcast at this particular time. Like most of you, I've got a number of different podcasts on my phone. There's different ones I listen to at different times. But on this one given day, I decided to look at the show presented by Mr. Bob Ruff. Whilst listening to an early episode of Season 6, The Murder of Mr. Jaime Melgar, I became intrigued by certain elements of the case that Bob was discussing. Specifically, I became intrigued at how convinced so many of Bob's audience were that an actual wrongful conviction had occurred. In some instances, members of his audience were convinced based solely on some statements made by Bob and one particularly clumsy mock-up demonstration photo which was posted on an associated Facebook page. Now, throughout my years of legal practice, I've come to be aware of one important thing. There is very rarely one side to the story, and accordingly, there are huge problems associated with presenting only that one side. So I began reading more about the case, listening to various episodes, and participating in some of the online forums associated with Bob's show. I was stunned to find that not only were some of those present on those forums actually convinced by Bob of a particular position of innocence, they were not being presented with even a fraction of the entire picture, and strangely, they didn't even seem to be asking why. Now, some of you might recall a photograph Bob shared on his page several months ago, which shows his co-host with a fluffy scarf wrapped in a bandage style around his arms. His arms were placed in front of his body. I couldn't believe so many of the comments that followed the posting of that photograph. Many of them noted that that photograph, and that photograph alone, convinced them that this was a wrongful conviction case. Think about that for a minute. Here we had a single photograph that, by Bob's own admissions, didn't even represent an accurate reproduction of the actual binding, let alone the position of the arms, that was seemingly capable of convincing groups of people that a wrongful conviction had happened. I was sure there had to be more to it. There had to be more to what Bob actually presents than that. So after quite a bit more reading, I was really surprised to find that no one connected with the podcast, including Bob, had made any real public attempts to recreate the restraint in a self-applied way in a fashion similar to that which had been described. So one evening after dinner, I decided to set about trying to recreate that self-applied restraint. I grabbed the closest thing I could find that matched as closely as I could the material as it was being described, and that was a bandage out of a first aid kit. I set about seeing if the restraint, in the way that had been described, could be self-applied. In less than half an hour, it was probably closer to 20 minutes, I was reasonably confident that the restraint, in the way that it had been variously described by Bob and others, could have been self-applied. So the following day, I proceeded to make a video demonstration, and I shared that on one of the Facebook groups connected with Bob's show. The immediate responses I received surprised me, but I now understand them clearly, and I'll get to that a little bit later. Firstly, the type of material I used was criticised, even mocked by some. The very action of uploading the video seemed to really upset some people, which obviously was never my intention. A group of people stated that the material I used had a certain amount of stretch to it, and that the binding used in the case they were considering had zero stretch. Now, I didn't question that statement about the stretch of the actual binding material in question. Those that have followed this case know that that is now incorrect, but again, I'll get to that a little bit later. So rather than questioning that, about 2 hours or so after posting that first video, I posted a second video, this time completing the same demonstration but using a rigid sports wrap that had zero stretch, and I demonstrated that at the beginning of the second video. But after posting that video, rather than the criticism dying off, it simply changed direction. The criticism I then received turned to the width of the material that I'd used in the demonstration. Over the next week or two, I went on to produce another 4 video demonstrations of this self-restraint process, making 6 video demonstrations in total. Each of the video demonstrations was adapted in various ways to accommodate the immediate and sometimes absurd criticism that I'd received of the material I was using. The final 3 videos were in direct response to a challenge made by Bob that the knot in question was a so-called handcuff knot. It is also known as a bow knot and a fireman's chair knot. Now, Bob asserted that the knot on the actual binding was now known to him as being a handcuff knot, and he questioned whether that could be self-applied. My 4th video showed that not only was it possible to self-restrain in a manner described, with the suggested knot and using the material of the length, width and stretch prescribed by Bob and others, it was actually the easiest by far to self-apply. The final 2 demonstration videos were done to demonstrate that whilst the binding could be easily self-applied, it was, in my experience, entirely implausible that it would be used to restrain someone else. The nature of the knot and the position of the arms made it almost impossible to do. Now, it seemed to me that despite the 6 video demonstrations I'd undertaken and posted on the page, the very same people that were convinced of a wrongful conviction by a single inaccurate photograph posted by Bob were not at all willing to even consider the possibility that this one simple element of the case might not be the way they believed it to be. It's worth reiterating that point, thinking about it again. A number of people were convinced, fully convinced, by an inaccurate photograph by Bob, but those same people were not prepared to even consider an accurate demonstration video by someone else. Not just one demonstration video, 6 demonstration videos, all adapted based on suggestions about ways that it could be improved. So I was beginning to understand the way in which Bob operates and the way in which his episodes and the material they contain are purposely designed to mislead his audience and support his given narrative and his focus. Over the time of conducting these demonstrations, I received a number of threats. 2 directly via Messenger and 1 which was posted directly onto the Facebook page associated with Bob's show. These threats referred to various things, including my demonstration videos, and suggested that if my contributions with respect to asking relevant questions and challenging the suggested narrative didn't stop, then I would be removed from the page. The threat posted on the page remained visible for approximately 5 hours, at least 4 hours and 45 minutes after some admins on the page were made aware of it. I'm not going to talk too much about that. If you want to read more about what the threats were, if you want to read about my response to that and the responses received from Bob and one of his page admins, go to our website, click on the About Us section, or the About Us tab at the top, and you can read a bit more about that. A number of weeks later, about a month ago now, I was removed from the page. And when explaining the reasons for my removal, Bob himself refers to various warnings that I'd received about my conduct on the page. Now, it's important to note here that I didn't receive any direct warnings from Bob or any website admins. The only warnings I'd received had been the ones that had been included in the threats. And they forecast the exact thing that ended up happening, my removal from the page. Following my removal, I was overwhelmed with messages of support and thanks from members of Bob's associated Facebook pages, members that I hadn't interacted with before. It was obvious that my video demonstrations and many of the questions I'd posed on those pages had created quite a positive impact, at least for those that had remained largely silent in those groups. In my opinion, Bob had succeeded in surrounding himself with a small, vocal group which not only took his word for grandiose statements he made, but immediately and viciously attacked those that sought to challenge the narrative. The result was a small group of people that devoutly followed Bob and largely prevent, through intimidation and threats, anyone speaking up against his claims, against the narrative that he wanted to forward, no matter how absurd or unbelievable those claims or that narrative may be. After some strong words of encouragement from many, many people, and thank you very much to everyone that did, the idea of Truth is Justice was born, and some weeks later, we proudly find ourselves here. Why the name Truth is Justice? It's quite simple, really. Truth itself is justice. Without the truth, there can be no justice. Sometimes the truth is difficult to comprehend, sometimes it's uncomfortable, and sometimes it's downright shocking. But that doesn't mean it isn't the truth. The truth can be elusive, and that is why those tasked with initially uncovering the truth, those involved in the investigation phase of a criminal case, have such an extraordinarily difficult job. The truth can be difficult to prove, and that is why those tasked with prosecuting crimes and presenting the truth to a courtroom, in front of a judge and jury, have such a difficult job. Murderers are not always burly masked men that scream out criminal. They can be anyone, from the person you stood behind at the counter to the person you sat next to on your last bus or train ride. The truth is often very uncomfortable, but nevertheless, it is still the truth. When only one side of an argument is presented, it's dangerous. But when only one side of an argument is presented and it is supported by only sections of material, it isn't just dangerous. At best, it's intentionally misleading. Now, Bob's show has become accustomed to relying on making statements that seek to portray the evidence in a misleading way. Many of these statements have no basis in reality, but once spoken by Bob, many of them are considered fact, at least by his small group of devout followers. Consider for a moment my reference earlier to the amount of stretch in the binding material used in the case currently being considered by Bob. A number of references were made to the binding material having zero stretch. There was no actual confirmation of this, and no evidence was offered up to support the assertion. It simply fit better with the underlying narrative, and was a way to criticise the demonstration videos mentioned earlier. The statement had been made so many times that the material had zero stretch that it simply became accepted as fact, without any basis for it. Comments were made by a jury member on the very same page that confirmed having physically held the binding in question that the material was indeed stretchy, significantly so, up to 30% I believe he referred to. The reaction by some was, disappointingly, to challenge that assertion and to not believe it. The statement that the binding had no stretch had become so accepted within that group that even presented with direct evidence to the contrary, it was not going to be accepted. Incredibly, the misleading statements have gone even further. What is obvious now, to me at least, is that combined with the misleading statements, Bob's show focuses on ad hominem attacks, attacking the person rather than the statement, and on calculated, denigrating attacks on those individuals which are associated with the position counter to the show's narrative. These attacks are often sustained over a lengthy period of time, and the show, with Bob at the helm, encourages the audience to join in on the attacks, sometimes with devastating consequences. Importantly, this focus on particular individuals often starts innocently enough. We'll have a few contradictions here and there'll be a few challenges to their opinion, which seeks to set a particular tone. Then commence the comical memes that have become so popular via Facebook, and the rhetoric is stepped up a notch. Before long, the show's devout followers are freely criticising the individual in question on the show's associated Facebook groups, even going so far as to research their background and family, and in some cases openly mocking aspects of their lives. All of this starts from a handful of comments made at some earlier point in time by Bob. Now, importantly, that handful of comments, as it turns out, are often completely false. They have no basis in reality. They are simply designed to create an atmosphere of anger and hate towards the individual in question. They further the narrative, and they rev up the so-called army. Now, this approach should frighten and disgust everyone. Not only is it an appalling way to conduct yourself, it goes directly against the very fabric of what is publicly stated as that show's cause. Bob and his show appear to be operating under the mistaken belief that they are somehow justified in making baseless and unwarranted attacks on individuals who, in many cases, have committed their entire careers to working for the benefit of the public. Nothing justifies the reckless and irresponsible approach by Bob and his show in that regard. As we will do with all the misleading statements, we'll be highlighting the way that Bob, via his show, creates an environment of distrust and hatred towards individuals associated with cases. We will highlight the way this is done and demonstrate why it is based on false and misleading statements. We will do this not because of any formal connection with those individuals, but because it is the right thing to do, the proper thing to do, the just thing to do. Because a show that publicly states that it is focused on finding the truth and seeking justice cannot be allowed to get away with false and misleading statements designed to cause significant and lasting damage to others. We are that group to challenge those statements, and we are the group to set the record straight. Now, with respect to our podcast, this is what you can expect. We will release an episode each week where we address some of the things I have highlighted earlier. We will welcome in relevant special guests who can provide you with a unique insight into aspects of the case we are focusing on. We will take feedback from all of you on statements you believe that need to be addressed, and we'll do so in a way that is considerate, mature and professional. What we are doing is not designed to be entertainment in a TV show drama sense. As I said before, we're focused on the truth and setting the record straight, not on reveals. These are murder cases, horrible crimes with real victims. There is a place for entertainment and loose treatment of the facts, but this is not it. Now, if you're interested in participating, we encourage you to join our Facebook group, which you can link to through our website, truthisjustice.com. We encourage you to check out our website and all the material contained within its pages. Our website contains literally thousands of pages of material. Transcripts, laboratory reports, witness statements, incident reports, and hundreds of photographs. Equip yourself with all the relevant information to make an informed decision about this case. A new thread will be created every Friday on our Facebook group, where you can submit what you believe are misleading statements, inaccurate assertions, or other material which you would like us to cover on our weekly podcast. We really look forward to working together with all of you to provide some desperately needed balance to a discussion that has well and truly got out of hand. Now that we've finished with an explanation of who we are, what we do and what our focus is, it's time to turn our attention to the case of the murder of Mr. Jaime Melgar. Jaime Estuardo Melgar, also known as Jim, was born on August the 10th, 1960 in Guatemala. He was the youngest of 3 boys. The family emigrated to the USA when Jim was 3 years old, settling in Houston, Texas. Jim and Sandra attended the same school in 1977, and their relationship developed over the next 3 years, culminating in a wedding on December the 12th, 1980. Their union resulted in a marriage which lasted 32 years and produced a daughter, Elizabeth, or Liz, who was born in March 1985. Around the time of Liz's birth, Jim and Sandra were attending meetings of Jehovah's Witnesses, studying the Bible and filling themselves with an accurate knowledge of Jehovah's will. They would eventually become baptized into the church. Jim worked in IT, building a successful medical billing business. Sandra was a nurse until various medical conditions, including lupus and epilepsy, resulted in her leaving that profession and working from home. Their daughter Liz would have significant difficulties during her early childhood, extending to the time of the murder in 2012. In her own words, which you can find by visiting our website and looking at our case materials under Elizabeth Melgar, Liz describes how at the age of 11 she was diagnosed with severe depression and anxiety, and as a result, as Liz describes it, she was prescribed antidepressants, antipsychotics, anticonvulsants, and anti-anxiety medicine. She goes on to state that these medications didn't work, and that she needed to keep cycling through them as she grew older. In reflecting on her childhood, Liz noted how it was believed that there was a mix-up at the hospital. Such was the way that she didn't fit into the religion into which she was born, even telling of her plans to escape its grasp. A traumatic event resulted in her being disfellowshipped from the Jehovah's Witnesses, about 6 years before Jim's murder. Liz and her father had a strained relationship, which Liz discusses in her writings mere weeks before Jim's murder. Liz notes how they spent a year living under the same roof without speaking a word to each other, because as Liz describes it, they are such different people. She describes how she worries about the thought of having children, and her parents being involved, to use Liz's words, "I'm scared of the brainwashing that they may try to attempt with my kids." Liz even describes how at her own father's funeral in 2012, she was treated like a leper. Liz highlights how Sandra had a different approach to the strictness of the religion's practices to those held by Jim, and how in the period of time leading up to his murder, Jim had focused on a more committed approach to the practices of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Just 2 months before Jim's murder, whilst visiting her parents for a week, Liz notes the significant difficulties that she was having with her father, describing one interaction as making her blood boil. Liz talks about how a conflict over a rule, implemented and enforced by Jim, that no disfellowship friends of hers could visit their family home, resulted in her staying with a friend and, as Liz describes it, spending the remaining visit with just her mother. The Jehovah's Witnesses maintain strong views on not observing traditional days of celebration. Christmas, Easter, birthdays, even children's birthdays are not celebrated. Jim and Sandra's 32nd wedding anniversary came and went with no celebration, but it was not as a result of Jim and Sandra's religious beliefs. Wedding anniversaries can be celebrated by Jehovah's Witnesses. 10 days after the actual day of their 32nd wedding anniversary, on the evening of Saturday, 22nd of December 2012, Jim spoke with his brother about a planned celebration at his home the following evening, which had been organised a day or two earlier. Following that telephone conversation, Jim and Sandra went out for dinner at a nearby Mexican restaurant that they frequented often, Los Cucos. Los Cucos is located just under 6 miles, approximately 10 kilometres, from their home. They each ordered a dish and Sandra ordered a pina colada. They paid their bill at 8:59 p.m. and on the way home they decided to stop at CVS Pharmacy to purchase some soft drinks. The CVS Pharmacy they stopped at is just over a mile, or roughly 1.5 kilometres from their home. They purchased a 2-litre bottle of Coke and a 1.25 litre bottle of Sprite at 9:33 p.m. Whilst we don't know a specific time of death, we do know that sometime over the next few hours, Jim was murdered in his bedroom closet. He had a total of 31 sharp force injuries and had sustained multiple skull fractures. At approximately 4:30 p.m. on Sunday the 23rd of December, Jim's brother Herman, his sister-in-law Maria and their daughter Marissa and a few other family members arrived at the Melgar home for the planned dinner. They parked their vehicle in the driveway beside Jim's truck. The garage has 2 single motorised doors. Now when you view it from the front of the house, the door on the right-hand side was fully open. Herman was the first person to enter the home and he did so initially through the garage after trying the front door and also walking around to the back of the house without success. Herman opened the front door of the home to allow entry of the other family members. Once they were inside the home, Herman heard screams of help, prompting him to run further into the house in the direction of the master bathroom closet, being guided by the screams. Upon investigating the source of the voice, Herman discovered that a chair had been placed in front of the master bathroom closet and, after moving that aside, he discovered Sandra, lying on the floor, restrained. Herman recounts in his statement, which was given just hours after finding Sandra, how Sandra was tied by her hands and her feet and how Sandra pointed out to him where scissors could be found to allow the removal of her restraints. Herman notes that he removed the wrist restraints by cutting the binding, and upon his wife Maria arriving in the closet, he asked her to remove the ankle restraints, which Maria did, again by cutting the material. Now, according to the statement given by Maria, just 3.5 hours after finding Sandra and cutting her free from her ankle restraints, she notes that she discovered Jim's body in the master bathroom closet and ran outside and across the road to ask a neighbour to call the police. She then returned to the master bathroom closet and assisted Sandra in getting up from the floor. Maria recalls how at this time she was trying to prevent Sandra from seeing Jim, but Sandra got away from her and she saw Jim's feet protruding from the master bedroom closet and approached his body. Law enforcement officers arrived within minutes of the discovery of Jim's body and they secured the crime scene. Sandra was attended to by EMS medics who performed a visual assessment of her, including observing her wrists and her ankles. Deputy Jennifer Martinez, who was present during this assessment, noted there was no markings or redness on Sandra's ankles or her wrists. Sandra went on to refuse to visit a hospital for further assessment of her condition, and then a short time later she accompanied detectives to 601 Lockwood Drive, the Detective Bureau headquarters for the Harris County Sheriff's Office. On the 23rd of August 2017, following a 2-week jury trial involving more than 24 witnesses and thousands of exhibits, Sandra was found guilty of the murder of her husband, Jim Melgar. On the 24th of August 2017, Sandra was sentenced to 27 years confinement. Many of you may be familiar with the often provided narrative of what happened on that terrible evening in 2012. You will notice that our narrative above is somewhat different, and there is one very good reason for that. Our narrative incorporates the facts, and only the facts. There have been narratives that have incorporated such minor details as fact, when those so-called facts simply have no evidence to support them. Now, an example of this is the statement that Sandra entered the home first, and after one trip inside, Jim returned to the car which was parked in the garage to collect further items. Now, this is just a small example, and the version often touted may very well be true, but the reality is we simply do not know. There is no evidence to prove it happened that way, except for Sandra's own words. Equally, there have been narratives which incorporate as fact long, complex stories, including those that stated that Sandra and Jim took a 2-hour-long jacuzzi together. The narrative continues that for that next 2 hours, with the jets running in the jacuzzi, Jim and Sandra discussed their love for each other and spoke about exciting plans that they had for the future. Now, there are certainly pieces of evidence that are suggestive of and appear on their face to be consistent with certain aspects of that story. But again, this narrative relies almost entirely on Sandra's own words. Importantly, both of these examples of elements of the narrative are not known as fact. They rely on the word of one person, the very person convicted of the crime of murder, Sandra Melgar. Now, it's this apparent urgent willingness by some to accept as fact the story which has been provided by the convicted, where we believe so many of the discussions surrounding the murder of Jim Melgar have gone awry. We will demonstrate to you why it is crucially important in this case to distinguish between what we know as fact and what relies largely, or in some instances entirely, on Sandra Melgar's own account of the evening. Next week, on Truth is Justice, we will start the process of highlighting each misleading statement and setting the record straight. We look forward to having you join us on Truth is Justice.